Yes, university is done for the year, meaning that I can play a mind-screwy visual novel without worrying about losing focus in school. Let's see. Remember 11, The Age of Infinity. Wait, isn't this the one people say has a ridiculously unsatisfying ending? Nah, it can't be that bad, but it would make a really hilarious and quirky introduction to an online review of the game if it was. Let's play! Hey, remember 11? I hope you burn in. Remember 11 is the third entry in Kids Infinity series, taking place in the same universes as the other two games, Never 7 and Ever 17, with a lot of references to both. And I've also reviewed both games. Psst! That's a tip! Go watch them! The game was released initially in 2004 Japan for PC, and later for the PS2 and PSP, but never in North America. Akin to its predecessors, Remember 11 is a visual novel, except this time, it's more of a mystery sci-fi thriller, thus being much closer to Ever 17 or 999 in terms of plot and story progression, and much more focused than the fluffy, oh I guess we'll throw in some sci-fi but pretty much this is a game about tits, Never 7. In addition, Remember 11 employs a much darker tone, packing 33 endings, and 31 of them having your protagonist shuffling off the mortal coil, which is always just peachy, but more on that later. Wait, 33 endings can be divided by 11, which makes 3, and 3 in binary is 11. Oh, I see what you guys did there. Anyway, let's get into the premise, and as a quick note, I do try to keep these reviews as spoiler-free as possible. I don't consider anything within the first hour to be a spoiler though, so with that being said, let's begin. In 2011, Kokoro, a third-year criminal psychology major, is aboard a small plane on her way to an island in Japan housing a mental institution which houses a mass murderer, Keiko Inabushi, a young woman with dissociative identity disorder, who took the lives of 12 innocent people in a hospital during a late-night massacre in an event that can only be described as horribly brutal and not something you want to see unless you want to reacquaint yourself with your breakfast. Aboard the plane, Kokoro befriends an 11-year-old child named Yuni before the plane abruptly crashes into the mountains. Soon, it's revealed that only Kokoro, Yuni, Yomogi, an experienced mountaineer, and Mazumi, a twatbag of a lawyer, survived the plane crash and found refuge in a small cabin containing a limited amount of supplies that won't support them for more than a week in this ridiculously hostile mountain environment. And as tension builds up, the group struggles against the elements and sometimes each other to survive until hope hopefully arrives. Meanwhile, a young man is climbing up a clock tower and reaches the top before being knocked off by a mysterious shadow, and awakens later inside the aforementioned mental institution, housing the aforementioned murderer, Keiko Inabushi, who seems to be less harmless while under another personality, Hotori Suzukage, and he also meets Uzumi, presumably the psychiatrist and calm maternal figure who runs the completely isolated facility in the walled-off island, along with another, or perhaps the same, Yuni, who also mysteriously showed up at this facility after the plane crash. On top of this, your male protagonist, who only identifies himself as a science student named Satoru, has severe amnesia, and it would appear that someone in this cuckoo house is trying to do him in. See, for most games, this premise would have already been more than compelling enough if they stopped at the plane crash, but leave it to the writers of 999 to go the extra step. In addition to all this crazy shit, Kokoro and Satoru seem to be switching minds during the incident. Satoru switching to Kokoro's body, slowly dying off in a blizzard-ridden mountain cabin, and Kokoro going to the mental home, completely cut off from society with somebody trying to murder her. It's Freaky Friday the game. As the player, you follow either Kokoro or Satoru through their various personality exchanges across a 1-week period, alternating between the cabin and the mental institution. For every question that's answered, about a dozen more replace them. How and why are these two exchanging personalities? Was Kokoro's plane crash and the survival of these four really an accident? Who is Satoru? Who's trying to kill him? And how are their two unis coexisting? And that's just the tip of the iceberg, and the easiest way for me to explain the overwhelming premise of a game that knows how to make a fascinating setup that rivals anything I've played. In short, if you're not hooked by the first half an hour, then I'd suggest booking a ticket to that mental ward because you are crazy. But now, I have to get into these characters in a little more detail. Our heroine, not the drug, but I wouldn't be surprised if drugs were somehow involved in the creation of this game, is Kokoro, a naive, well-intentioned young woman who always remains optimistic and energetic, though she isn't quite ditzy either, as she doesn't often succumb to the pressure of the horrible things happening around her, whereas I would roll up in the corner and start singing the Pokemon theme song for support. Pokemon, gotta catch 'em all. I know it's my destiny. I would have liked to get a little more background info about her, but as she still stands, a great heroine. Our hero is Satoru, who is a great mix of mostly cold logic, somewhat nerdy, reliable, and just interesting to watch. He also forms a great contrast to our mostly emotional heroine, yet both are extremely easy to get behind. I preferred playing as Satoru for his pinpoint logical deductions that shed more light on a story that made it quite easy to get lost. Uni is the little kid that appears in both places somehow, being very extreme in his emotions and usually brightens the mood, though as a character I'm not a fan. He's meant to be the male form of the overly cutesy character that appears in all these games, but I just found him to be more annoying and suspicious than anything else. My hate for him may stem from his similarities with Carl from BlazBlue, but whatever. Kids suck. Yomogi is probably my favorite character outside of Satoru, as the reliable and fatherly leader of the cabin survivors. He always tries to keep the morale of the group high, while his overall goal is saving everybody, and being a likable everyman who tries to accommodate everyone's needs reasonably, yet he isn't afraid to lay down the law when it's necessary. But his job is not easy because of Maizumi, the easiest character to hate in any game ever. Except maybe Slippy. Besides being a selfish douchebag yet, she's flat out horrible to the other people in the cabin, and even her backstory fails to redeem her in my opinion. If she wasn't in the cabin, it would be nowhere near as chaotic. Thus, I can't help but feel she was thrown in there just to raise a little hell. Not to mention some of her bad endings. Maizumi, the one we all love to hate. Let's switch over to the mental institution, where we have Utsumi, the motherly figure of the institution, who seems to be in charge and shows strong character traits. But then she does things that are incredibly suspicious too, making her like a Nurse Ratched of the place? But she's half native something, so wouldn't that make her chief too? Oh, I totally failed at throwing a one flew over the cuckoo's nest joke in here. Like many of the other characters in the game, there's a certain sense of danger in not being able to predict what she or the other characters are doing and why. And to round it all out, we have Keiko Inabushi, who supposedly believes herself to be a young woman named Hotori Suzukage, and she was the most interesting character to watch, though a terrifying character to interact with given her murderous past and incomprehensible mood swings. Like most women. You just have to play to see, because it's really just horrifying to have no level of predictability with a character like this. And those are the main characters, and in my opinion, an extremely strong cast who all bring a lot to the table and make this mystery all the more fun and interesting. Since no one is 100% trustworthy, of course I have to mention that these characters can flat out mirror the characters in both Never 7 and Ever 17. I understand though, it's the idea of repetition and cycles that the series is going for, so I'd even consider it intentional. I liked this cast more than the other two games though, because they actually chose characters that are radically differently aged, like a 35-year-old man or a 20-something-year-old woman, that made this feel at least a little more realistic and led to some less traditional humor as the result of various ages. Few you love to hate, some you'll come to love, but all are pushed to their mental and physical extremes. Fun times! Do I really have to go over the core gameplay again? Come on, it's a choose-your-own-adventure novel, no real gameplay other than reading, and some pretty heavy mystery and scientifically saturated reading, at that. So anyone looking for a lighthearted adventure full of action, look somewhere else. You make choices, and making illogical choices will sometimes lead to your untimely demise, but you can easily get back to wherever you want to go via shortcuts, quick saves, etc. The game is very accessible when it comes to an abundance of features that help you where you want to go. This is on top of some great extra content, like pictures, audio, clear lists, etc., but back to the actual gameplay. What sets this game apart is how you navigate through these two locations, the tiny cabin and the big facility, and you basically have to juggle 3 stories at once. What's happening with everybody at the cabin, who did what in the mental institution, and what's this phenomenon happening between Satoru and Kokoro? The game rewards paying attention to details in all 3 stories, not to mention that it's just an incredibly compelling way to tell a mystery story, filled with red herrings, clues you'll miss if you don't pay attention, the works. Although it might seem overwhelming, the ability to replay scenes and reread text makes it more manageable, at least. If you take it slow and use the tips section, basically extra information about the story that can be accessed through the game like a glossary, then you'll really get into this story, and it won't seem like that much of a daunting task. TV Tropes said it best: it's a mind screw like its predecessor, but you better bring your own mind screwdriver. As Satoru in the mental institution, you transfer to Kokoro's body in the cabin. I thought that the transformation should sound something like this.
And I feel like a woman.
And BAM! You're a 20-year-old sexy girl. I know the first thing I would do if I were in her body. Touch myself! To find out if I had any survival equipment. Perverts. And back at the mental institution, you take on Satoru's body, which should sound like, oh my god, here comes the penis. And although it's also snowing like hell over there, you're well fed, warm, but you're locked inside an almost deserted mental institution with no ability to contact the outside world, and somebody's trying to kill you. Pick your poison, really. Unlike the other games in the series, there are only 2 main paths. Firstly, Kokoro's and then Satoru's, meaning that there are only 2 good endings out of 33, and hell, even calling them good is debatable. I have to mention that I think this is a much more compelling system than having like 5 paths that are each about getting into a girl's pants. For the most part, I just liked how the game seemed like it was above that, and it was really refreshing. The main focus was on telling a good sci-fi story. And speaking of the actual storytelling, the writing is strong. The game was translated by the good folks at TL Wiki, who also translated Never 7, so I'll leave a link to their site below. Also, they did an amazing job with the translation, as I never caught one error or really awkward phrasing, and the descriptions, dialogue, everything was all masterfully done. Hell, even the really confusing Japanese grammar issues, I can't really explain it, you have to play it to understand, are avoided thanks to a great job by these translators. The pacing of the story is the same story. Redundant, too lazy to edit. There's rarely a dull moment where you aren't either learning about something in the story, having your face slapped by a major plot twist, or not on the edge of your seat. Like the other games by these writers, you'll just find yourself saying WTF at least once an hour, if not more, though there are some periods where the game gets explanation heavy, but even this is necessary with a complex story like this one. Unlike how Ever 17 generally took its time and had noticeable slowdown and speed ups, Remember 11 is always pushing itself forward, and focused. Not that there's anything wrong with what the former does, but I prefer a fantastic story in roughly 20 hours than one in 50, where some of the endings there don't even really add anything. Just my opinion. What I find so fascinating about this game is like how 999, Virtue's Last Reward, and Ever 17, the writers of the game actually research real-world facts and science and incorporate it into the game. When a character gives a long-ass speech about physics, to a point, that's real physics, which is so awesome. Why don't more games do that? Truth really is stranger than fiction, and I'd often rather learn something about the real world than something illogical that writers pull out of their ass. And it also makes the events of the game feel somewhat realistic, which is awesome. It isn't just science either. The game encourages more outside research into biblical studies, ethics, Jungian psychology, Japanese folklore, and more. Yeah, I know that opening your anything with a Bible quote is a cheap way to make a game seem epic, but it actually works here, and all these factors I mentioned actually help you interpret the game in a different light, from a psychological standpoint, religious, cultural, scientific, personal. There's just so many levels. It's staggering when you consider it all. You can even consider real-world history, like the crash of the Japan Airlines Flight 123 in 1985. A crash that left 4 survivors in the Japanese mountains, and one of them bared the name Kaiko. It's just all part of this fourth wall breaking, mind-bending visual novel effort. And as I said, the amount of thought and effort that went into this story and universe is unparalleled. The tone of the game is also worth mention. Even earlier on, the game solidifies itself as, by far, the darkest in the series, being disturbing, unsettling, and absolutely terrifying at a lot of points, making it a lot more like 999 than Ever 17 or Never 7 as a result. Seriously, these bad endings are flat out disturbing, meaning that I had to friggin' sprint to the bathroom at 2 o'clock in the morning scary. Like rivaling a certain 999 ending scary. What's best is how it's rarely some kind of jump scare, it's mostly from the charged atmosphere. There's just danger always around you. There's nobody you can really flat out trust. Not to say that this game's a complete downer, it certainly has its lighter moments and great jokes, but the overall focus is on a darker and much more mature plot, which differentiates it from its kin and makes it a compelling ride. Speaking of the ride, I can't avoid discussing the ending, without spoilers of course, but oh my god, when I first got the final ending to Remember 11, I remember distinctly saying to myself that this could be the biggest Blue Balls moment since Evangelion, since it was a cliffhanger ending that many say desperately could have used a third route to tie up loose ends. I've heard multiple stories, mainly that the team ran out of money by the end and were forced to tie it all up like they did, but I really don't know. Despite joking about it in the introduction, I'm gonna go against the grain and say that I thought it was a fitting ending to a game about putting the pieces together. I have a feeling it's not even meant to be 100% solvable, only open to interpretation. So it can be really frustrating on one end, yet it's so ridiculously intricate and fascinating at the same time, mostly from how memorable that ending is. And cliffhanger endings just always add a sense of mystique and timelessness to a game, in my opinion, that makes you want to go back and replay and reconsider. Aside from that, you can check out some of the outside reading and discussions that dedicated fans have gone through in incredible, ridiculous OCD detail, and they came up with some really solid theories that do tie up at least a good chunk of the supposed loose ends, if you don't feel like figuring it all out yourself. The graphics in the game were a strong improvement from the predecessor, and I have to say right off the bat that whoever does these openings, or whoever creates or plans out these openings, they're friggin' incredible. It's like every time this team makes such a kick-ass introduction that just demands attention. I would also say that this game is a lot more graphically impressive than Ever 17, because mostly is small things. Really, the locations themselves aren't anything special, and even the character designs, though memorable, go for more of a sense of realism, which is fine considering the tone of the game, but what I'm pointing out is the small touches, like the frosty breath in the cold cabin. It's all just part of that important sense of immersion that pulls you into the world like any good visual novel should. Accordingly, a lot is left to your imagination, but that's fine too, for reasons I mentioned in my Ever 17 review. If I had to complain, the only thing I'd go with is that the character models could have had a lot more expressions and postures to add to the story, but my imagination sufficed. The music in the game was pretty fantastic, which is on par with the other games in the series. They all perfectly capture the fear, the anxiety, the excitement, and they bottle it up with a nice techno soundtrack that includes some strong piano pieces to really top it off. It's debatable whether it's stronger than Ever 17's soundtrack, and I certainly think it's better than Ever 7's soundtrack, but for what it is, there are many iPod-worthy tunes. The voice acting is under the same umbrella. It's amazing. I would have liked an English dub, but that's a lot to ask for considering that this game never came out in North America. But these voices still do a really good job of pulling you into the story, and I can't pinpoint anyone who did less than an amazing job. In conclusion, if you're a fan of 999, or the other games in the Infinity series, or mystery science fiction in general, you owe it to yourself to play Remember 11. The gameplay, story, graphics, sound, it's really hard to pinpoint anything I really disliked about the game without kind of nitpicking. The closest I could come is harping on the ending, but in that respect, it's really not the game's fault as far as I know, and from what kind of story the game was going for to that point, I could even see it as intentional in some ways. It's meant to be a mind bender that requires a lot of time, dedication, and thought, and if that's not what you're looking for, then go play your PS8s and your K-Box 1s. Considering that the game was never even released in North America outside of the translation, it seems unlikely that we'll get anything this thought-provoking and challenging from these guys. And that's the bad news. But the good news is, Ever 17 and Remember 11, and okay, Never 7, are games that you can still play today, right now. Since Ever 17 is ungodly difficult to track down in English, and the other two don't even have official English translations, I'd suggest going to TL Wiki to find out how you can play these amazing games today. Again, link in the description below. And in addition, please tell me if you know about any other games like these ones, like 999 or Ever 17 and such. I'd honestly love to know and play them because these are honestly some of the best games I've ever played in my life. To wrap it up, Remember 11 is a game you'll never forget. Yeah, I went with that one. Thanks for watching.